Well, here we are. It's 2025, and it still needs to be said. Vaccines do not cause autism. It's honestly really sad that this does need to be said, but it does, because a few weeks ago, a paper went viral claiming that vaccines do cause autism. And a lot of people picked that up and used it as evidence that vaccines cause autism, including our current HHS secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
I'm going to be an advocate for strong science. You show me those scientific studies, and you and I can meet about it. And there are other studies as well, and I'd love to show those to you. There's a study that came out last week of 47,000 9-year-olds in the Medicaid system in Florida. I think a Louisiana scientist called Mawson that shows the opposite. So there are other studies out there. I just want to follow the science.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr. claims to be a good guy who just wants science, but I'm going to show in this video he doesn't know what science is, because him and everybody else who is promoting this paper as evidence that vaccines cause autism are just wildly incompetent. I'm sorry, that was a little mean. If you've been convinced by an influencer that vaccines cause autism because of this paper, I'm sorry, you've been misinformed. If you're an influencer or a person in power using this paper to say that vaccines cause autism, you are wildly incompetent. So let's go over the paper. I've got my notes, I've got my hair picked out, and I don't have brainworms. So let's get into it. So this is a paper that pulled data from Florida's Medicaid program from the years 1999 to 2011. It pulled data for 42,032 vaccinated individuals versus 5,123 unvaccinated individuals at age 9. I say unvaccinated that way because these children could very well have been vaccinated, as we will see. They then go on to compare autism diagnoses in the vaccinated versus unvaccinated groups, and they claim to find that the vaccinated groups have more autism than the unvaccinated groups. But there are, of course, massive problems in this analysis that the authors did not control for, which ultimately renders the paper useless in trying to answer whether or not vaccines cause autism. The data was specifically pulled from Florida's Medicaid program. Medicaid traditionally tends to serve the more impoverished or underrepresented communities in America, which can skew the results of a study like this because impoverished people generally don't visit the doctor as much as people who are more well off. So their kids might be less likely to actually go to the doctor and receive a diagnosis if they have autism. You might think that the researchers could control this by looking at how many times the children actually went to the doctor's office. They didn't do that. So you can't do that analysis. You can't know if the kids who got diagnosed with autism more were just going to the doctors more and thus getting their vaccines more and thus more likely to get proper diagnoses from a medical professional. But the ways that this paper is bad do not stop there. So next, because these data were pulled only from Medicaid, it's only capturing vaccines that were provided through Medicaid. It does not include vaccines that could have been given to these children through other programs or other clinics. So, I mean, I don't know what else to say about that. They didn't confirm that the children were unvaccinated. They just pulled a selected source of records and ignored all other sources of records. Cool, I guess. Does anything else need to be said about this paper? They couldn't actually confirm that the kids were unvaccinated. So, what are we doing here? Why do bad studies like this get so much attention from people who either don't read them or don't know how to interpret them? They also did things that were more sneaky, like restrict their analysis only to children who were enrolled in Medicaid until the age of 9. This again means that children who go to the doctor more often are more likely to get a proper diagnosis of autism by age 9, whereas children who don't go to the doctor as often and don't get as many vaccines are less likely to get that diagnosis. Not because they get fewer vaccines, but because they don't go to the doctor as much. Not going to the doctor and never getting diagnosed doesn't mean you're never going to get cancer. So yeah, that's pretty much all you need to know about this study. It's so poorly designed that they can't determine whether their unvaccinated kids were actually unvaccinated. But this paper came out several weeks ago at this point, so there are other science communicators who have already covered this. So I'll provide links to their debunks of this paper as well in the description below. They also go into a few more details, so check out links like that. And I can just hear the anti-vaxxers already complaining about, well, what explains the rise in autism, Dr. Wilson? Well, it's not a mystery, random anti-vaxxer. It's pretty well explained just by the fact that autism diagnostic criteria has gotten a lot better. We can be sure that this is the case by applying today's autism diagnostic criteria to older generations. And when we do that, we see that the autism rates are pretty similar. So when Robert F. Kennedy Jr. talks about how he didn't used to see people who were autistic when he was younger, yeah, it's probably because you were on too much heroin, dude. People with autism have always been around and they've always existed. You just never acknowledged them, or you just weren't educated about them. That's a you problem. It's also just a society thing. I mean, mental illness in general, but also neurodivergent people 50 years ago were treated way differently and viewed way differently than they are today. So it's just society changing and pretty much getting better in that regard, at least. Anyway, again, it's just not a mystery why autism diagnoses are increasing. And if you want to know what another good study looks like that actually asks the question, do vaccines cause autism? Look no further than Dutch researcher Anders Havid. He has published several papers looking at this question, and probably the biggest one is one where he and his team looked at data from pretty much all the children in Denmark. One advantage they had looking at this data set in Denmark is that Denmark has a universal healthcare system. So all the healthcare records were centralized, and they didn't have to worry about messing up their data by only looking at Medicaid, because Denmark just doesn't have that issue. God, I wonder who I voted for. The study mostly looked at whether or not the MMR vaccine causes autism, and the answer was a flat no. But this study also included a sub-analysis of children who were completely unvaccinated, which basically allowed them to ask, does the vaccine schedule in its entirety increase the chance of autism relative to people who don't get any vaccines? And the answer, again, was a flat no. All those studies that I talked about and more are going to be linked in the description, so be sure to read them for yourself and actually read them before you come at me telling me that autism is caused by vaccines, because I will tell you you're stupid, and it is insulting to say that vaccines cause autism in 2025. You're an adult, you have the scientific literature at your fingertips, you should know better. And that's about it for this paper. Easy peasy debunk. Vaccines don't cause autism, they never have, never will. So thanks for watching. See you in the next video.